Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's December 24, 2018, and this is episode 643. Today we continue our Morocco tour as we venture into the Sahara Desert for some beautiful photography in this exotic land. As I sat down to prepare for this episode with the memory of Morocco slowly fading into the past, I thought to myself that I could probably wrap this up with today's 10 images and then move on to something else next week. Fortunately for us, photographs are a wonderful thing. I went through my remaining 3 stars and higher photos, hitting the Q key on my keyboard, as that's the key that I've assigned to the shortcut to drop the currently selected image into a folder that I've specified as my selects collection. Well, even though I was being somewhat selective, a few minutes later I had 49 images in my collection that I still wanted to talk about, so I guess wrapping this up today is out of the question. I will try to whittle this down to just 20 more images though, so that we can finish this series next week in the final episode of 2018. The first image that I wanted to talk about was the hand of a musician as he plucked away at what I believe is called a cintir or a guembri, but these are supposed to have only 3 strings, and in the photo that we see here, there are 2 darker coloured strings that seem to be beneath the main 3 strings. The instrument was obviously handmade though, so maybe he just added a couple of strings to build on the capabilities of the traditional cintir. I left my shutter speed down at 125th of a second for this shot because I wanted to record some of the movement in the hand to show how energetic the playing was. You can hear the instrument being played in the music that I'm playing right now in the background. My other settings for this image were f5 for a shallow depth of field at ISO 100 with a focal length of 85mm with my Canon EF 85mm f1.4 LIS lens. You know, I was never too concerned about adding the EF mount designation when describing my Canon lenses, but now, as I also own and we'll be talking about the new RF 24 to 105mm lens pretty soon, I guess I'd better start making a point of saying which type of lens I'm referring to. The steel castanet type instruments that you can hear and also see in this next image are called carcabo. The cintir is also a traditional 3-string cintir in this shot too, so you can see what the entire instrument looks like. I thought it was nice that the kids are starting to get into what is probably a family business, and you'll be glad to know, if you think about these things like I do, that it was a Sunday when we visited these musicians so the kids weren't being kept out of school to play in this band. It's a lovely experience to be able to listen to this music and photograph the musicians at close quarters as well. My settings for this image were a 320th of a second at f5.6 ISO 100 with my focal length still at 85mm. Later on the same day, we drove to the camp of some nomad people where I photographed this young man in his black turban. I've actually darkened down everything except his eyes because the eyes are what I really want to draw attention to. But I realised that in doing this I'm creating a somewhat sinister looking character, especially from a Western perspective where we tend to associate this kind of headwear and covered face with terrorists. I don't want to allow that to stop myself from using this image though, because in the desert this is really just their way of keeping the heat of the sun off their heads and the sand out of their ears, mouths and noses. I also can't deny that there is a part of me that also just wants to work with the image like this. To fly in the face of common thinking, where this kind of image might cause fear or concern, when the reality is that this is just a kind young nomad sitting for us to photograph him in exchange for a small financial reward. My settings were 640th of a second shutter speed at ISO 100 with an aperture of 3.2, again with my 85mm lens. The first night that we spent in the Sahara was in a large lodge with big rooms, but to get ourselves situated for the camel ride out into the dunes, before we continued to photograph on this day, we'd moved to our luxury tents just far enough from the lodge for us to feel as though we had the Sahara to ourselves. We spent an hour or so to settle into our tents before regrouping to mount our camels and then ride deeper into the Sahara, looking for a nice spot to photograph the camels with their handlers, as we'll see in the next few images. This first shot shows our camel handler taking the first walk up into the dunes, making the first footprints, so we wanted to make sure that everyone was ready before we started shooting here. We walked through the strategy and what we were going to do before we asked the camel handler to start walking into the dunes. My settings here were a 320th of a second at ISO 320 at f10 and a focal length of 100mm with my Canon EF 24-105mm Mark II lens. This next photograph is just moments later as the camel handler reached the top of the sand dune that I'd asked him to walk up. We had to call out to get him to walk a bit faster because the camels were starting to bunch up, and it looks much better if you can get a little bit of separation between the camels like this. Although I'm overall quite happy with most aspects of this photo, there's often something, a tiny detail or two, in a photo that really appeals to me. In this photo, it's the sand whipping along the back edge of the dune that the camels are walking on, and also how the sand is whipping off the brow of the dune in the middle on the far left of the frame. We were lucky to get a good bit of wind for this shoot, and we used it to good effect in some other photos that we'll look at shortly, but I do recall pulling sand out of my ears for at least a day after finishing this shoot. My settings for this image were a shutter speed of a 250th of a second at ISO 320 with an aperture of f10 at 182mm. I had my 100-400mm Mark II lens on a second body and was switching between them as necessary. Although we had 3 camel handlers with us, I found that from the first shoot, when we had 2 of them walk their camels up a dune and then back again, my favourite 3 images were of the same man and his camels, because we had the least footprints in his shot. The second guy was no longer walking through virgin sand, and the images just don't look quite as good. They're usable, but when you're trying to whittle down a selection, it's a good reason to move on to the next shot. Here we see the first camel handler coming back, and I really like how he and the camels are mostly against the band of dark shadow on the dune behind them. I've actually darkened down the shadows a little more with the levels and tone curve in Capture One Pro, just to increase the overall contrast and to stop the dunes looking a little washed out. My settings for this were ISO 800 for a 250th of a second at f14 with a focal length of 227mm. One thing to note here is that the use of the 100-400mm lens at 200mm or so really helps to compact the elements in the frame, stacking the distant sand dunes up, making them look as though they're much closer than they did in the first shot that I shared with you from this location. We had hardly moved between these shots, but the distant dunes appear much closer and, more importantly, larger in this image because I changed my focal length from 100mm to 227mm. From this point, for a while, we had some time on our hands as we needed to wait for the sunset before finishing our shoot. We had the peak of a dune running to the right of the spot that you see in these last three images, that we were hoping to have the camels walk along with the sun on the horizon behind them. And we were slightly mortified when three tourists strolled past on their own camels, but they made for a good photo, and from the angle that we were going to shoot, we could live with their footprints. The other great thing about having a little time on our hands was that we were able to photograph our three camel handler models relaxing initially, as you can see in this image. Again, I like how the sand is being whipped up along the brow of the sand dune in front of the camel handlers. It's also a nice illustration of how their headwear is being used to keep the sand out of their ears and mouths, as I'd mentioned earlier. My settings for this image were ISO 320 for a 320th of a second at f10 with a focal length of 400mm. As I also mentioned earlier, we were able to have some fun with the wind, as you can see in this next image. We asked our camel handler models to first take off, then put their turbans back on, allowing them to blow in the wind. It was great that the wind was strong enough to get their turbans out almost horizontally, and with these men looking into the sun, they have great catch lights in their eyes. I have lots of these images, but we'll just look at a couple of different variations after this. My settings here were ISO 500 for a 320th of a second at f10 and a focal length of 263mm. Perhaps a little bit cliché, but we couldn't help but ask the camel handler to go to the top of the dune as well, so that we could shoot him against this wonderful big cloud that had formed up there. I can't help thinking of romantic classics like Lawrence of Arabia when looking at photographs like this. The contrast was actually a little bit harsh, but the shadow slider at 100 in Capture One Pro helped me to pull back a lot of the light in the face of this man, so I'm pretty happy with this photo. My settings were ISO 250 for a 320th of a second at f10 and a focal length of 300mm. While we had the opportunity, we asked another of the camel handlers to also go to the top of the dune, and this time photographed him sitting down with his turban blowing in the wind. This time I decided to crop the image to a 16:9 ratio to give it a more cinematic feel, and that also enabled me to reposition the man towards the top of the frame, which makes him look higher up with less space above his head. My settings for this image were ISO 400 for a 250th of a second at f10 and a focal length of 400mm. Although we used the time that we had waiting for the sunset pretty well, I now need to keep you waiting for the sunset, because that's our 10 images for this episode. So we'll start part 4 with some camels in the sunset as we walk through our final 10 images from this year's Morocco tour and workshop. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favourite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and Google+, etc. And links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care, have a great week, and a very Merry Christmas to you. Bye bye.